سيذكر من يخشى ويتجنبها الأشقى الذي يصلى النار الكبرى ثم لا يموت فيها ولا يحيا قد أفلح من تزكى وذكر اسم ربه فصلى بل تؤثرون الحياة الدنيا والآخرة خير وأبقى إن هذا لفي الصحف الأولى صحف إبراهيم وموسى صحف إبراهيم وموسى صدق الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد وبارك وسلم. اللهم اجعل جمعنا هذا جمعا مرحوما واجعل تفرقنا من بعده تفرقا معصوما ولا تدع فينا ولا معنا شقيا ولا محروم. اللهم إنا نسألك الهدى والتقى والعفاف والغنى. اللهم أخرج من قلوبنا كل قدر للدنيا وكل محل من حوض يميل إلا معصيتك أو يشغلون عن طاعتك أو يحول بيني وبينك كحقك بمعرفتك الخاصة ومحبتك الخالصة. اللهم افتح لنا بالخير واختم لنا بالخير واجعل واكب أمورنا بالخير بيدك الخير وعافية إنك على كل شيء قدير. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون والسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله. ما شاء الله. شكرا لفاتنة Rabia Isaac for that clear-raising and steering melodious Quranic recitation, and a special shukr to Marisa for the beautiful dua, mashallah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant our students the fortitude and strength to grow in their seeking of knowledge, inshallah. I'm sure that each heart, upon hearing that recitation and hearing that dua, has been touched by the beautiful reminder of the divine presence and light. Before I introduce the keynote speaker, I would like to point out a few house rules, inshallah. Please ensure that all cell phones are on silent or switched off or in flight mode, inshallah, so as to avoid disruptions and the frequency of disturbances to our sound system. Restrooms are, as you exit the hall, to the right for the females, first door to the right, further down the passage, and to the right for males. Later on, during the program, we will be having a tea break, and this will coincide with Asr Salah, inshallah. So we will break for about 20 to 25 minutes, and the Salah facilities are upstairs, inshallah, for those females who wish to go upstairs. And for those females who have a particular challenge taking the stairs, there's another room further down the passage, inshallah, where you can perform your Salah. The refreshments will be served in the cafeteria, and this is as you exit the foyer to the left of the parking lot, inshallah. So you will enjoy some refreshments in that space. Now, without further ado, allow me to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Fatima Sidat. Dr. Fatima Sidat read for her PhD in Islamic law at McGill. She presently holds a senior lectureship in gender studies at the School of African Gender Studies, Anthropology and Linguistics at the University of Cape Town, UCT, where her long-term project is concerned with the convergence of historical and traditional published numerous academic articles writing against a backdrop of Islamophobia and militarized Muslim masculinity. Her publications theorize the convergence of Islam and feminism through a decolonial reading of both intellectual paradigms. The topic of Dr. Sirat's keynote address is titled Maqasid al-Sharia and the Objectives of Gender Justice in the Realization of Women's Sexual Health and Reproductive Rights. I hand over the podium to Dr. Fatima.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين سيدنا ونبينا مولانا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. أما بعد. First, I'd like to thank the organizers and the authorities of the university for this invitation. It's truly a privilege to be invited. Especially we're invited to speak within our own communities. And I recently moved up to Cape Town, and if you're not sure where I moved up from, my Indo-Pak Tajweed at the beginning would have given it away. So I come from Durban, but having moved to Cape Town, I take this now as my community. And I feel rather privileged to be called to speak within my community and to speak to you as an audience of the community. I'd like to speak about how Muslims make meaning. In asking this, I am asking, what are the ways in which we as Muslims come to know and understand what things mean in their Islamic sense? How do we understand, give value, measure right and wrong, and produce for ourselves a way of knowing that is Islamic? The late Shahab Ahmed, a profound scholar of Islam, explains that when Muslims seek to find meanings of things, they do so with the existing terms of engagement, by which is referring to the context or the historical vocabulary of the context of Islamic society. This context emerges directly from the text of the Quran, the pretext or the historical moment in which the Quran arrives in a community, and the context refers also to the global ummah of Muslims now more than 1400 years old. This historical vocabulary is part of the apparatus through which we make meaning. It is the hermeneutics, which simply refers to the system that gives us meaning. In a nutshell, what I mean to say is not really something new, but Muslims make meaning of the world and their location in the world through reference to a set of historical and contextual indicators derived from and associated with the Quran and the life of the beloved Rasul. But while we are able to know many things, it is also true that there is much we do not know. And from our traditions of exemplary figures, there is Imam Malik, who is known as much for his knowledge of the Sunnah as his commitment to admitting that he did not know. He has said that the shield of the scholar is to say, I do not know. If the scholar neglects this, the scholar will receive a mortal blow. In fact, there's a narration that he was once asked, I believe it was 40 questions. Someone came from far, asked him 40 questions. Apparently, he replied to 4. And to the rest, he said, I do not know. And when he was asked, what do I go back and tell the people about these other 36 questions? He replied, I do not know 36 times. So between these multiple ways of knowing and the value of not knowing, recognizing our inability to know all things, there are the contradictions of what it is to be Muslim. But these contradictions are not at all problematic for the Muslim mind. They are what Shahab Ahmed also calls coherent contradictions, meaning that within this system, there is, in simple terms, method in our madness. And I want to start here because I want to really avoid the sense that we have that there's only one single way of being or one single way of being Muslim in what I want to say now. I want us to bear in mind the role and the value of contradictions and our own roles in making or finding coherence within these contradictions. Before you think that I'm saying something radically new, I ask you to recall the many ways in which we ourselves manage to hold some very contradictory ideas in our heads all at the same time. In fact, according to the wisdom that is held in the contemporary online industry that produces memes, this is not unusual to see, and so apparently, if we can hold contradicting or opposing ideas in our minds at the same time, it means we're rather intelligent. I'd like you to keep that in mind. One more thing I'd like you to keep in mind, and yes, everybody in the room can do this. I'd like you to keep in mind what it means to be a wife. What it means to be a wife. Okay. Focusing on the topic, what we're told I would be speaking about. There are two important studies that I'd like to share with you. Both of these speak to issues of sexuality, consent, and sexual desire. And the reason I'd like you to focus on these issues is because right now in the Muslim world internationally and in our own country locally, there's a lot of news around sexual offences. Ideas of consent, authority, and accountability are front and center. This is a statistic from 2016. 30,000 rape cases in the 9 months between April and December. The equivalent of 110 reported cases of rape per day. Equivalent of 4 rapes or 4 women raped every hour. We are meeting for 5 hours today. In case we don't think this applies to us, because as Muslims, we only have sex within marriage, here are some more troubling statistics. In 2010, in Gauteng, the gender-based violence indicator gave us these figures. 8% of women experienced intimate partner rape on more than one occasion, which is rape from somebody you are in a relationship with. More than 18% of men admitted to having raped their intimate partner. Now, the two studies I want to take you to are important because of these statistics. And they look at the sexual experiences of Muslim women within marriage. The first and earlier one is by our own, and I'm not sure if she's here, our own esteemed Professor Sadia Sheikh at UCT, and her then PhD student, now Professor Nina Hood, who is at Oslo University. And the second study was done by one of my own master's students, Dr. Maryam Bodhanya, who is now lecturing at UKZN. In the first study, which was done in the Western Cape, amongst other issues, women were asked about the nature of their sexual relationships and how they made decisions about sexual and reproductive choices. Muslim women. Amongst their findings was that religious understandings seem to induce women to have sex with their spouses, even those that are in abusive marriages. Additionally, respondents often understood religious teachings that affirm sexuality as intimately linked to the needs and desires of men, their husbands. While some women wage open spaces of religious contestations, others internalize religious perspectives that compromise their ability to make satisfying or even self-preserving sexual choices. And yet other women seem to prioritize their right to a healthy, fulfilling sexual life as part of their narrative. In what ways can and do religious teachings induce women in abusive relationships to have sex? And what is the problem if a woman has sex with an abusive partner? In what ways are women compromising their ability to make self-preserving and sexual choices? These questions go to the core of the heteronormative sexual relationship at the base of Islamic marriage. Classical legal scholars are clear that the legal paradigm of marriage is a contract of milk, a contract of ownership, where a husband pays mahar to secure the sexual exclusivity of a wife. And I know we have some very modern understandings of mahar, that it is about financial independence for a wife. Historically, though, that's not how the classical scholars saw mahar. They saw it as awad, as a consideration, as a payment. So mahar is paid in order to ensure sexual exclusivity. A husband, though, is never himself required to be exclusive to his wife, unless it's stipulated in the contract, and therefore scholars differ as to the legality of the stipulation that restricts polygyny. But that's aside. Taking the second of the two types of findings that we spoke to earlier, so just go up. Yeah, back. There we go. Yeah. Women internalize religious perspectives that compromise their ability to make satisfying or self-preserving choices. This is from the first study. Now, Maryam Khan's master's dissertation confirmed this. Interestingly, she began her study by examining contraceptive choices of a group of Muslim women in KZN. So you have one study in Western Cape, and this study now is in KZN. And she went in looking to learn about contraceptive choices. Instead of learning what she thought she would learn, which was that women make their contraceptive choices based on religious teachings, what she found was that women were making contraceptive choices based on their health, on what worked for their good health, for their sense of mental, emotional, physical, psychological health. And instead, what she found was that women's religious understandings, though they were not influencing what contraception they were using, they were influencing how and when they were sexual. Meaning that women would often have sex regardless of their own desire. And they did this in order to fulfill what they believed is their duty to be sexually available to their husbands. Now, the first important conclusion is that Khan's study supports Hul and Sheikh's study. But a second interesting outcome is that both studies did not go in seeking religious understandings of sexual relations. In the first, the researcher was asked about sexual experience, but not about it in a religious context. In the second, the study was asked about contraception, not about sexual experience. Most significant for us is that in both these studies, women linked their experiences of sex directly to one single hadith, and which I shorthand as the cursing angels hadith. Many of you may know this hadith. From Hul and Sheikh's study, one woman explained how she had made sense of her relationship with her ex-husband, who sometimes would have sex with her without her consent or cooperation. The next slide. In essence, it's a violation. I didn't think of it like that previously. My mindset was that I'm a Muslim woman. I should be obedient toward my husband. That time, my brain told me he has a right to have access to my vagina. And so I didn't think it is a violation at that time. Just that I have to do it because I'm a good Muslim woman. And good Muslim women satisfy their husbands. On the next study, which was Khan's study, to please your husband is to please Allah. And the curse is on a woman who is disobedient to her husband. We read the hadith, we go for Dalian. The hadith are all authentic hadith. So the hadith we are reading, it's a lesson for us. And one last quote. Islamically, it's not allowed to say no. You should give it whether you're happy or not, because at the end of the day, he's going to be happy with you and you're going to have a happy relationship. I'm talking from my point of view because I know if I say no all the time, he becomes aggressive. He becomes angry. So probably we just have to give in whether we like it or not. Just give in. So in Hul and Sheikh's study, being available to satisfy their husband's needs was often discussed also in terms of sex as ibadah, or the idea that sex is charity. But they concluded an important observation, namely that the asymmetrical and hierarchical relationship created by the cursing angels seems to be what dominates women's obligations for sexuality within marriage. Both studies interrogate the implications of a system of sexual relations that leaves women in a position where they feel compelled to be sexually available for fear not only of losing their husband's favor, but for fear of losing Allah's favor. The ethical implications of this fear are significant in how they conceptualize women's personhood in two aspects. In the first aspect, what does this mean for ideas of mutuality and reciprocity in a relationship? Is there a cursing angel for men too? If so, we hope there isn't. There shouldn't be one for anybody. And if so, do men also spend their days worried about not fulfilling the sexual needs of their wives? What does it mean when a woman's choice is between undesirable sex and undesirable curses? Or when pleasing her husband is considered pleasing to God, even when she's displeasing herself? Secondly, what does this tell us about women's spiritual agency and the direct God-believer relationship? What does it mean when an individual's relationship to the Creator is mediated by their bodily submission to meet the sexual desires of another against their own desires? I link the second aspect to the idea of khilafah, the idea that each individual has a direct relationship and indeed accountability to the Creator. The idea of khilafah emanates from the Quran, where Allah says, "Verily I will create a khalifa on earth." Khilafah pertains to moral agency and the ability to act so as to realize the will of the Creator. And here we begin from the premise that moral agency is not differentiated amongst people based on their skin colors, their class positions, or their gender orientation. The corollary to moral agency is accountability, and so khilafah and dhimma are parallel aspects of the individual, who is Abdullah, servant to Allah. Now I'd like to take you into a work study that I did, where I looked at a 17th century commentary of the 13th century text. It's called the Nur al-Anwar by Mullah Jivan. It forms part of the subcontinental Darul Uloom curriculum. And so I used it, and in it I studied the concept of legal capacity, al-ahliya. And this is the beginning of that discussion. The idea of dhimma. Dhimma refers to the covenant which we acceded to with our Lord on the day of the Mithaq, when, with a pronouncement where Allah says, "Alastu bi rabbikum," and we said, "Bala." Allah asked, "Am I not your Lord?" And we said, "Of course you are." And with that we affirmed and we admitted Allah's lordship, and we confirmed that Allah's laws are valid for us all. A person is born and they have proper dhimma for obligations due to and from them. So all people are born partaking of the covenant, and all are accountable to Allah for obedience to Allah's laws. In keeping with Mullah Jivan and Imam Nasibi's analysis, dhimma reflects the accountability that emanates from this primordial commitment to the lordship of Allah. It is undifferentiated at birth, and all humanity has accountability. Believers and unbelievers both have accountability, but the unbeliever is not similarly accountable in religious matters. The slave and free person are also accountable, but the slave's accountability is reduced because the slave person is owned. Legal accountability is inherent in all people and not differentiated between men and women, each having legal accountability to Allah, and sex difference does not distinguish legal accountability. Legal capacity emanates, so al-ahliya comes from dhimma. The obligations due to and from an individual who has dhimma come together within the idea of ahliya. And in Islamic law, there are two types of ahliya. If we go to the next slide, we'll see them. We keep going. There we go. So here you get legal capacity, al-ahliya 101, very quickly. So legal capacity is determined by fullness. Legal capacity is determined by fullness and maturity of the body and the mind, and is composed of two parts. Capacity for obligations, ahliyat al-wujub, and the capacity to contract, which is ahliyat al-ada. So we're all born with ahliyat al-wujub. We're all born with capacity for obligations. Of course, when we're young, the obligations don't apply to us. If we are mentally incompetent too, they don't apply until we become competent. But eventually, once we get to the stage of puberty, we also acquire the capacity to contract. So complete legal capacity is achieved when there's fullness of body and fullness of mind. When the body is full and free, so it's fully developed, it's fully mature, and it's a free body. When the mind has developed fully, from the mind of a child to the mind of an adult, then it also has developed and is complete. And with those two aspects, ahliya is embodied completely in the individual. The absence of one or both, so the absence of either maturity of the body or maturity of the mind, means that there is an impediment to legal capacity, to full legal capacity. And the scholars are agreed on three impediments at least, though there are more. A child, because body and mind are not mature. Someone who is mentally incompetent, since the mind is not mature, they may have adult body, but the mind is immature. A slave person historically, and this wouldn't apply now, where though the body and mind are both mature, the body would be owned by somebody. So the individual wouldn't be at liberty to do what they wanted to do, what they needed to do. Now these are three of the impediments, and there are many more. I'm going to take you through a full list of them so we can see what the full list is. And the list is divided in two. One is a list of what is impediments that are Allah given, and the other are the list of impediments that are acquired through our own willfulness. So I'll read it from the beginning. Minority, we've spoken about. Mental incompetence, we've spoken about. And slavery, we've spoken about. There is also a form of mental deficiency, which is not complete incompetence. The idea of forgetfulness, those of us who are ADD will be glad for this. Sleep, I'm glad we're not accountable when we're sleeping, or unconscious. And there's certain types of accountability that are relieved from us when we're ill. And then there's menstruation and postpartum bleeding. Striking a chord, and I'll come back to it. And then there's death. Of course, we can't be held accountable while we're dead, but we can be accountable for what we did while we were living. The other side is a list of impediments that come to us by virtue of our own volition. Our ignorance on an issue, drunkenness, fooling around when we're jesting, travel. So certain obligations are released from us at that point. If we spend too crazily, there's also a category for that. When we make mistakes and when we're under duress. Yeah. So is being female considered an impediment to legal capacity? Short answer, no. Classical jurisprudence does not include an impediment to legal capacity which is premised on a gendered subjectivity. Being female is not considered an incomplete state of body, nor is it considered an incomplete state of mind. And I must say, when I first read this, I was delightfully surprised. The thing is, I read this in a historical text. I read this in a text which originates in the 13th century. When I have been reading similar texts about legal capacity, which are published now or in the past 100 years, I read otherwise. There I came across the concept of incomplete legal capacity or naqis legal capacity, which is associated with women. And so part of my study, which I haven't really gone into here, is to show the difference between what happens historically and what we're talking about now. But let's stay with this historical concept, where being female is not considered an incomplete state of body. And if we go back to the two lists, you'll see that on the list, femaleness, femininity doesn't appear. There's something that appears which applies exclusively to women, which is menstruation and postpartum bleeding. Right? So let's go and see what the scholars actually say about that. Okay? Are you sure? Are we sure that being female is not an impediment? Yes. And I think the jurists are getting this question as well, which is why if you look at the text, it says this very clearly. Neither menstruation nor, okay, I'd like to just give you a little background as to how it's done in the text. So in the text, you have a discussion of ahliya, and then you've got each of the categories, and they're listed one by one. And in each one, they go into a detailed some are page long, 2 page, 3 page. The one on postpartum bleeding and menstruation is that long. And this is what it says. Neither menstruation nor postpartum bleeding negate a woman's legal capacity. These two conditions only affect a woman's capacity to be in a state of cleanliness for prayer and fasting. However, this does not affect either her capacity for obligations or her capacity to contract. I don't think they could have been more clear than that. And the fact that they are so clear suggests to me that it was a question they were being asked. If you go to the next slide. This is just a quote from a contemporary scholar who supports this. He draws on Mustafa Zabqa, a not so recent scholar, but certainly not historical. And to make it clear that the sex of the candidate of legal capacity has no weight in determining the legal capacity of an individual. So femininity, being a woman, doesn't matter. Let's go next. So, what do we make of this? So, the students of, can we just go up one? I want to leave it there because you've seen that and you're not going to read. The students of Islamic law, of fiqh and usul of fiqh will know that the rules, the laws come down before the usul comes down. And the usul is derived from the laws. So we would think now that if we had all the laws around what women could and couldn't do first, then when the scholars derived the usul from the laws, they would have gathered together all these laws about inheritance, about witnessing, about all the various differences that apply to women in Islamic law, the difference in the law. They would have gathered all that together and said all this means women have different legal capacity. Women are inherently and fundamentally different. But they don't do that, right? And even a scholar who's commenting on the 13th century text in the 17th century doesn't do that. And that's important for us to remember. So now we can go down. So you might have expected the jurist to have taken all these various points of discrimination and put them into a single category of femaleness or being female. But they don't. And women are not characterized as different kinds of legal subjects. We can go to the next. It's the same idea. Okay, we'll stop there. Just go back up. So having concluded on women's khilafah through her personhood, the next thing I'd like to do is look at women's khilafah through a concept that has recently gained a lot of support, and it's a buzzword in Islamic law circles. Everybody's writing about it and conferencing about it. And it is the idea of maqasid al-sharia, the objectives of Islamic law. The basic premise of the law is that the law must work in the interests and benefits of humanity. Imam al-Juwayni first introduced the categorization of Islamic law in terms of the maqasid, and Imam al-Ghazali, who was his student, followed up on it, and basically came to a point where we've got these three categories of maqasid: what is indispensable, what is required, what are enhancements. And amongst the first, there are these five, and a later scholar added the sixth. The five being religion, life, so deen, nafs, aql, nasal, which is progeny, mal, which is wealth, and honor. So that is what the maqasid is about. Ibn Ashur, the 20th century scholar, advocated for a renewed approach to the maqasid. And he did this by having new terms, bringing new terms in. For example, he changed the idea, go back. He changed the idea of lineage into preservation of the family system. And in terms of deen, what he looked at was freedom of belief. So he's been translating these into more sort of contemporary ideas for us. He also introduced, importantly for us, a few new concepts, amongst which he introduced equality as one of the maqasid in their own right. And he's been taken as the basis, I think, because his work speaks to the human rights paradigm and he's brought in equality. So he argues on the issue of equality. We can go down now. Muslims are equal owing to their common created nature and their unity of religion. Anything in which the primal human nature attests to equality between human beings is treated by Islamic legislation accordingly. Human beings in the Sharia are equal with regard to what is indispensable, what is necessary. Only when there are valid reasons preventing equality do differences between humans arise. So beginning from the position of equality, differences amongst people also feature in terms of inequality. And these points of difference are instructive for understanding the potential of the Maqasid approach to inclusive gender justice. I'll take a moment here to go down. Very often when I speak about equality, people like to come back with this question. So I'm just trying to show which equality we're talking about. Not this one, that one. Yeah? That should save us some question and answer time. So, beginning from this position, Ibn Ashur says the reasons which necessitate the suspension and abolition of equality pertain to certain benefits or harms. And the obstacles preventing equality, he says, are either inborn, they're legal, they're social, or they're political. The discussion that follows, and then he goes to talking about these permanent natural obstacles of equality. And he includes amongst them the inequality of man and woman in certain areas in which woman is by nature weaker than man. And then he gives us the list of commanding an army, in terms of judge, in terms of being the sovereign. He gives us this little list. Now, if you're paying attention to what I've been doing, you'll notice that what I want to say here is that he took all of those little differences and he made them a category of inequality. Whereas the classical scholar didn't. They kept those inequalities various and random, but they didn't make it a category of inequality. And the difference is important because the difference is between an innate, inherent, essential aspect of difference, which is aligned to being female, and an understanding of difference, which is not about being female, but about being a person in the world having different roles and having different moments and interactions with different people. It's the difference from being essentially unequal to being socially and situationally differentiated. Okay? So, Ibn Ashur's analysis, in his analysis, women are naturally unequal. But in the classical fiqh, those very elements of a woman's body that renders her naturally different, which is the parts of her body that bleed in order to reproduce, are also clearly not the elements that detract from a woman's legal capacity. And that is significant. Because from Ibn Ashur and those who have followed him, and many have followed him, especially in the Maqasid debates, now people are following his ideas of equality. Within this analysis, there is no explanation for why women are different or weak or unequal, except to say that women are unequal because women are women. Circular logic. It doesn't work. Unless you have some sort of an understanding of the word woman, which is also naturally for you also something very different. So now that I've spoken for almost half an hour, offered you a few answers and probably raised more questions than even I can answer, what do we do at this point? What, or indeed is there even space for gender equality or gender justice in our understandings of Islamic law and how it applies to the ordinary lives of Muslims? From the classical jurisprudence, we see femaleness is not a natural form of legal incapacity. So when we argue for full and equal legal capacity for men and women as a foundational legal principle, if all people share in khilafah, and khilafah is not differentiated in sex, then how do we account for hadith that condemn women to a night full of curses, or worse than the curses? The very feeling that sexual availability is only minimally negotiable, and that being a wife is inherently tied to being maximally sexually available, as the women in the studies we spoke about showed. Now, some of this is tied up with our concept of marriage, nikah, which I've said before is universally understood as a contract of milk. And from this, I'd like to suggest that as the system of Islamic law has been established through its very legal capacity, where women are clearly not distinguished in their legal capacities, there is the possibility, however, that there is a category of women that has received very little attention in our study of the law. And that is the category which I asked you to keep in your mind earlier, the category wife. Yes. And I think we need to start talking about wife as a category. I think we can stop there. I don't think I have any more slides that are pertinent to it. Yeah. So we can leave it here. So that's a question. That we need to start talking about this category of wife. My research has shown that the category of wife is actually a unique Islamic law category that changes the legal possibilities for a woman. And so while we may be moving from a traditional to a more contemporary view of maqasid, since that is indeed the buzzword in Islamic law circles, we may also want to think and take a moment and look back into our earlier sources and look at how women have actually been portrayed. What kind of imaginaries of women existed in the classical law text, in historical or social texts? My hunch, and it's a well-informed hunch, is that there'll be much in there to bring us to new understandings of gender and of justice in terms of Islamic law. Returning to the beginning, I asked, how do Muslims make meaning? How do we produce for ourselves a way of knowing that is Islamic? I also asked that you contemplate the possibility of two entirely contradictory ideas at once. My proposal on conclusion is that even while many of us know and believe that indeed we are in direct relationship with our Creator, whom we know engages with the fullness of ourselves, and for whom we are in no ways inadequate, we also know that we live within a system of laws and regulations that frequently also violate our sense of human dignity, our sense of khilafah, and they compromise our ubudiyah, our capacity to engage with and worship our Creator in the fullest, most dignified ways. And women in other vulnerable parts of the community, people who are poor, people who are racially differentiated, workers, people with disabilities, the aged, we frequently keep these two positions in our minds simultaneously. It is the default position of those who are not part of the mainstream. What are the implications when the Khalifa seeks mutuality and reciprocity in relationship with her husband? What does it mean when a wife's choice is between undesirable sex and undesirable curses, or when the Khalifa is required to please her husband even when she's displeasing herself? What does this tell us about her relationship with her Creator? What does it mean when the Khalifa's relationship with her Creator is mediated by her bodily submission to meet the sexual desires of her husband against her own desires? As a community, we hold collective responsibility for ensuring that the fullest state of Khilafah is accessible to every person. And in our understanding of marriage and sexuality, we need to come to discussions that allow us to privilege mutuality and reciprocity over the cursing angels. Shukran, thank you for listening to me.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه وبعد. All praise and thanks is due to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Jesus, peace, blessings and salutations upon our master and exemplar Nabi Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Jazakumullah khairan for the invitation, for the university and for all those involved in hosting the trivia. I told my wife that I'm coming here today. She couldn't make it. She then asked me what the topic was about. And then I said it's basically about sex. And she said, is there going to be women there? So I come from a bit of a different background in that sense. Nonetheless, what I was asked to discuss is quite extensive. The proposal was a brief synopsis of the Islamic fiqh perspective on sexual health and reproductive rights in Islam, branching out into the right to sexual gratification, access, harmony, contraception, reproductive choices, abortion, rape, and marital rape. Each one of these require quite a bit of time. Nonetheless, inshallah, the intention is to navigate the topics that I have in front of me, which is a bit of all of them, and hopefully the 20 minutes will allow me to touch on them all. So, Islam recognizes that one of the basic needs of human beings is to satisfy their sexual needs. This may be oral, by listening to amorous words, maybe visual, by looking at that which arouses sexual desire, or physical, actually engaging in sexual acts of different types. However, because of the Islamic epistemology of how we actually derive law, the Quran, the Sunnah, the Ijma of the scholars, Qiyas or analogy, all of these indicate to the fact that the only permissible way for a Muslim to engage in sex is through marriage. And the sacredness of marriage is somewhat a difficult topic to navigate in our times because we are always dealing with this dualistic legal system. On the one hand, you have the Sharia, and on the other hand, you have our own South African law, you have the modern understanding of things, and then we have different ways in which we discuss these sensitive issues. So when we take it from a very legalistic point of view, we have to discuss the fiqh, we have to discuss things from a legal point of view in terms of the laws of the country as well. But on the other hand, our Sharia is also very much in line with the spiritual dimensions of this concept known as nikah or marriage. So, with that in mind, we will try to navigate both avenues, inshallah, because I feel that, especially now, it is very difficult to divorce the legal implications from the spiritual dimensions that is addressed together in the Quran and in the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So I ask at the beginning the purpose of sex. Islam prohibits illicit and harmful sexual activity so that human sexual urge is channeled to wholesome sexual activity that deepens noble aims like character and traits such as mercy and the establishment of a family and bringing forth of children. For example, this is encapsulated in the Quran, Surah Al-Rum, where Allah says, وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ أَنْ خَلَقَ لَكُم مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ أَزْوَاجًا لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُم مَّوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَآيَاتٍ لِقَوْمٍ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ. This is a very important verse in which we have to understand the legal terms with regards to the nikah and sexual intercourse. The ayah simply states that it is from among His signs. In other words, it is from among the signs and the miracles of Allah that He created for you from among yourselves, your spouses, so that you may find tranquility within them. And He placed between you affection and mercy. So the love and mercy concept is very strong as far as the spirit is concerned. In fact, the Prophet ﷺ made the relationship, as was mentioned earlier, between a married couple a source of reward for them and a source of sadaqah or charity. As the hadith states, narrated in Sahih Muslim, where the companions said to the Prophet ﷺ, after him explaining to them that in your physical intimacy with your spouse, there's actually a form of charity. And then they asked, in our fulfilling of our desires, is there actually reward? And then the Prophet ﷺ said, well, do you see if you were to fulfill your desires in a way that is prohibited, that you'd be liable for punishment? And then they said yes. And then he said, well, exactly like that. If you fulfill it in a way that is pleasing to Allah, you will be liable for reward, or you will be privileged with reward. So Islam acknowledges the existence of sexual desire and considers it to be one of the pleasures of this worldly life. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions this in various verses of the Quran, such as the verse in Surah Al-Imran, زُيِّنَ لِلنَّاسِ حُبُّ الشَّهَوَاتِ مِنَ النِّسَاءِ وَالْبَنِينَ. Beautified in the hearts of human beings is the love of desires for spouses and children and an array of other things that are considered the pleasures of this worldly life. Now, because I have to navigate the fiqh with regards to all of these topics, I'm going to include some of the things that we wouldn't normally discuss under a legal paradigm, but definitely forms part of our sunnah, forms part of our Islam and makes it beautiful in a big way. Number one, it is that intercourse should be preceded by kindness. This is very clear from the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, in that he used to, in a nutshell, encourage foreplay. The Prophet ﷺ would encourage that one speaks kindly to the wife, speaks kindly to the husband, and that the two of them have this type of intimacy before engaging in the act of sexual intercourse. So it's not looked at from the Sunnah perspective as this very legalistic thing. It's time for sex, let's go to bed, have sex, and that's over. Right? And the one is fulfilling the rights of the other. But rather, it is an act almost of devotion in that it begins with this. It initiates with a dua, a supplication, Bismillahi, Allahumma jannibna shaytana wa jannibi shaytana ma razaqtana. Oh Allah, I ask of you to, well, first of all, oh Allah, in your name. And then I ask of you to keep us away from Satan and to keep Satan away from us and to keep Satan away from that which you sustain us with. Meaning, if any progeny should be declared or decreed in that moment, that they be protected from the harms of Satan. Now, such an affectionate bond is something that has to take place within the ambit of love and mercy, within the ambit of tranquility. And to understand force taking place in such a situation is clear enough to show that the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ does not allow for any type of harm, but this will be further elaborated later on. It is permissible for a husband to have intercourse with his wife and vice versa, using only the private parts, the penis and the vagina, in whichever manner they feel best to their liking. Of course, this is derived from various verses of the Quran and from the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, in which Allah states, your spouses are a tilth for you, so go forth unto them as you wish. So, we understand that there's no prescription for positions and things like that. And then in the hadith of Rasulullah ﷺ, we have a misconception being mentioned by Jabir ibn Abdullah radiallahu ta'ala anhu, who said that the Yahud used to say that if a man had intercourse with his wife in her vagina but from behind, that the child would have a squint. And then the Prophet ﷺ mentioned this ayah, that I just mentioned now, saying that this is of course a misconception and not true. He said from the front or from the back, so long as it is in the actual vagina. Again, a hadith narrated by Imam al-Bukhari and Muslim. However, there are legal restrictions with regards to sexual intercourse in Islam, such as, number one, the husband may not enter into the back passage of the wife. The husband may not engage in sexual intimacy with the wife in her vagina during menstruation, as well as postpartum bleeding. And the husband may not cause harm unto the wife, which is why one of the laws, one of the preconditions of nikah is that she must be physically capable of handling intimacy. So even though the contract of nikah can take place, the act of nikah, which is sexual intimacy, the condition for which is hamil wat, that the wife has to be capable of that. Now the capability is of course going to be different from woman to woman. And once it is established that a wife is capable, that is to her establishment, then she may proceed and he may proceed in sexual intimacy. But if she feels she is not capable for some reason or the other, then this is of course going to be preventative in the act of physical intimacy. Moving on, if a man has intercourse with his wife, if a husband has intercourse with his wife and wants to come back to her a second time, then it is recommended in the Sunnah that he performs wudu. This is again part of that which I said wouldn't be expected in a discussion such as this. So cleanliness is definitely considered as part and parcel of the act of engagement between husband and wife. We also know that it is a necessary requirement for the husband and wife to engage in a ghusl, and we find many ahadith showing the relationship between the Prophet ﷺ and his wives, where they would perform this ghusl together, often using the same vessel, and there's lots of fiqh discussions that emanate from that. Such an amorous display of love and affection is part and parcel of the concept of nikah as depicted in the Sunnah. Thereafter, We move on now. There are many other hadith that I thought of mentioning, but time doesn't actually allow me to go into all of them. We discussed the issue of sexual access and gratification. So I looked at a fatwa by Mufti Muhammad bin Adam of the UK, Darul Ifta in the UK. And he mentions very interestingly, which is obviously a contemporary scholar giving his view of the right to sexual fulfillment. He says the right to sexual fulfillment belongs to both the husband and the wife. And it is wrong to assume that in Islam only the husband has this privilege. So, based on this understanding already, it would give some light on how scholars within the traditional, classical, orthodox, Sunni Islamic context would view a hadith such as the one that was shown earlier, the hadith of the cursing angels. The wife has as much right to expect that her sexual needs are fulfilled as the husband. As such, sexual relations are a right of both spouses. The renowned Hanafi jurist, Faqih, Imam Ibn Abidin, rahimahullah ta'ala, states that among the effects of marriage is the permissibility of each spouse deriving sexual pleasure from the other. This is a quote from Radd al-Muhtar, and he also says, Mufti now, he says, a husband is religiously obliged to fulfill the sexual needs of his wife and not deprive her of this right. Refusing sex without a genuine reason or excuse and using it as a weapon against her constitutes a sin in the eyes of God. So this gives once again a further clarification on how that hadith is seen by many jurists. Many jurists hold that it is obligatory for the husband to engage in sexual intimacy with his wife, and some even give a specific number. The likes of Imam al-Ghazali, rahimahullah ta'ala, mentions that based on his understanding of the number of wives a man may take, that it is obligatory for a husband to sleep with his wife at least once every 4 days. Should he have had 4 wives, that would mean he would be sleeping with a different wife each night. Abdullah ibn Amr radiallahu ta'ala anhu relates that my father married me off to a woman of good lineage, and he used to consult his daughter-in-law, that is my wife, and ask her about her husband. So she would say to him, he's an excellent man, a man who has not slept with us in bed, nor removed the veil from us since we came to him. When that went on for a long time, my father mentioned it to the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and then the Messenger of Allah alayhi salatu wasallam said, send him to me. So I went to meet him soon after, and he said, have I not been informed that you fast every day and that you pray all night, every night? And then he said, yes, O Messenger of Allah. Being proud, of course, of his accomplishments to an extent, he said, do not do it. Fast some days and do not fast other days. Pray during part of the night and sleep as well. He says, because your body has the right over you, your eyes have the right over you, and your spouse, your wife, has the right over you, and your visitor has the right over you. This is a combined narration from 2 of the 7 hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari. In this hadith, the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam advised Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As radiallahu anhu to be moderate in his worship upon learning that he had not slept with his wife since the time they got married. The Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said to him, your wife has a right over you, clearly defining the husband's responsibility of fulfilling the sexual as well as other needs of his spouse. Abu Juhayfa relates that the Prophet ﷺ joined Salman and Abu Darda radiallahu ta'ala anhuma together in brotherhood. This is the ta'akhwa that took place after the hijrah. So Salman visited Abu Darda and saw his wife Darda. And at the time she was poorly dressed. And thus said to her, what's going on here? And then she said, your brother Abu Darda has no need of this world. She was speaking, in the riddle. He has no need of this world, meaning he has no desire for me. And then Abu Darda came and made some food for him. And Salman then said, eat. So he replied, I'm fasting. And Salman said, I will not eat unless you eat. So then he ate. And in the night, Abu Darda went to stand in prayer, and Salman said to him, sleep. And so he slept. And then he got up again, and Salman said, sleep. And when it was the latter part of the night, Salman said, now get up, only now. And they both prayed together. Salman had said to him, your Lord has a right over you. Yourself, your body has a right over you. And your wife has a right over you. So give each rightful person their due right. Abu Darda came to the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam and mentioned this to him. And the Messenger of Allah alayhi salatu wasallam said, some man spoke the truth. Again in Sahih Bukhari. As such, a husband is religiously obliged to have sexual relations with his wife every so often, and some give a specific number, whilst others leave it up to the Quranic term, which is bil ma'ruf. As Allah says in Surah An-Nisa, وَعَاشِرُهُنَّ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ. And the understanding of this in terms of translation is usually somewhat inaccurate. In translation, you would often find that the word used is with kindness. But the word ma'ruf is far closer to that which is known to be good between those involved. Because the word arafa ya'rifu would be the origin of the word, and ma'ruf would be the ismul maf'ul of the word. That means that which is known to be good between the husband and the wife. Those are the rules governing what the husband and the wife actually, how they treat each other in their relationship. Moving on. This must be enough to maintain both the outwardly and inwardly chastity of both partners, so that they do not incline towards committing a sin. If a man consistently refuses his wife, he will be sinful in the sight of Allah and vice versa. However, as is with the case of the husband's right to sexual intimacy, this obligation is conditional on his physical ability as well to have sex with his wife. If he is too ill or weak to engage in any sexual activity, or he fears that having sex with his wife will result in unbearable weakness, and the same rules apply to the wife, then they will neither of the two of them will be sinful in this regard. Now again, all of the above mentioned things are at the level of law. The spirit of marriage, however, is different. And the spirit of marriage should be seen in light of the ayah quoted previously, that Allah Ta'ala placed tranquility within a marriage with love and mercy. Seeking one's rights through demands and argumentation contradicts the spirit and never solves anything. Rights should always be understood in light of following the prophetic guidance. The most perfect of believers are those most perfect in character, and the best among you are those who are best to their spouses. In other words, خيركم خيركم لأهله وأنا خيركم لأهلي, or كما قال عليه الصلاة والسلام. Moving on from this point, making herself available to her husband is considered in classical legal fiqh one of the duties of the wife, but this should be seen in light of what I just mentioned. Furthermore, it should also be seen in light of the fact that one of the most stressed laws and duties of the Prophet ﷺ was the kind treatment of spouses. He said that the husband, in a nutshell, must have a good attitude towards his wife and be kind to her and offer her everything that may soften her heart towards him, and she should do likewise for the reciprocation of that. So because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the meaning of the ayah in Surah An-Nisa quoted earlier on, that's chapter number 4, verse number 19, وَعَاشِرُهُنَّ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ. So rather than being governed by legalistic terms, the couple should govern themselves and their behavior by that which is known to be good between the two of them. And they, women, have rights over their husbands as regards living expenses and other things similar to those rights of their husbands over them. This is a verse in the Quran in Surah Al-Baqarah, chapter number 2, verse number 228. Now, importantly, in a husband demanding his right for sexual access and gratification from his wife and vice versa, it is important to note one of the overriding principles throughout our Sharia is la darar wa la dirar, that there should be no harm and no reciprocation of harm. This is one of the basic principles of Islam, because harming others is definitely and indisputably haram, as in the case with strangers, so a fortiori in the case of those who are bonded together in holy matrimony. It was narrated from Ubadah ibn Samit radiallahu ta'ala anhu that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, La darar wa la dirar. Hadith narrated by Ibn Majah, and this hadith was also classed as sahih by various ulama, including Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, Al-Hakim al-Nisaburi, Ibn Salah, and others. Among the things to which the lawgiver drew attention in this matter is the prohibition of hitting or beating to the extent it causes harm. It was narrated from Jabir radiallahu ta'ala anhu that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said in his farewell sermon. He said, fear Allah concerning women. Verily you have taken them on the security of Allah, bi kalimatillah, and intercourse with them has been made halal for you by the words of Allah. And you two have rights over them, and that they should not allow anyone in your company or on your bed that would displease you. And then he said, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, but if they do that, then you may take them to task, but not harshly. Their rights upon you are that you should provide them with food and clothing in a fitting manner, narrated by Imam Muslim. It is oft quoted as well that some of the dying words of our beloved Messenger Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam was that you should fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with regards to women folk. Time does not allow me to get into the details of contraception, abortion, and others. But I can, inshallah ta'ala, do with the time that I have to summarize the discussion into one. In that, scholars are generally going to allow contraception. In that, this type of practice, the type of practice known as azl, was found in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. The Sahaba radiallahu anhu specifically stated they used to withdraw, which is called coitus interruptus, during the time of the revelation of the Quran. Other narrations explain that the Prophet ﷺ was aware of this and he had not rebuked them in any way, which means taqreer took place, that's tacit approval of that particular act. So further than that, scholars therefore allow contraception with the idea of not wanting to have kids for some or the other reason. However, there are certain problems with certain types of contraception that requires further investigation. So contraception is often looked at as something that prevents conception from taking place. But certain types of contraception actually prevent a fertilized egg from attaching itself to the uterus of the mother. This in essence means that the egg is already fertilized, but then it is technically, in a very technical sense, aborted soon after. And because of this type of distinction, the link between contraception and abortion is very closely tied. And the differences discussed within the topic of abortion are also the differences discussed here. For example, there is no consensus as far as abortion before 120 days is concerned. But there is consensus, or ijma', that after 120 days after conception, abortion is not permissible. Before that, scholars differ. Some allow it up to a particular period, whilst others do not allow it at all. So the issue with regards to certain types of contraception that prevent the fertilized egg from attaching itself in that way would thus also be considered a matter of ikhtilaf. Then there's a further problem in that certain types of contraception require something called kashful awra, which is basically a woman exposes herself for some reason or the other. And kashful awra is a sensitive issue within the Islamic paradigm because there needs to be a need for that to take place. And because of the alternatives which exist within the issue of contraception, kashful awra becomes a problem when there are actually alternatives. To be frank, things like the copper T and other devices which need to be inserted within the vagina of the woman, those acts of insertion has to be done by a doctor, which means kashful awra needs to take place. And that kashful awra is a problem because there are other forms of contraception. It's not considered a need, it's not considered a haja or a darura. So those are some of the discussions that require further elaboration, and unfortunately time doesn't allow for elaboration into that. Of course, the issue of rape and marital rape in and of itself requires, I think, a symposium. But nonetheless, I did my best in terms of navigating the topics that I was asked to do. I ask you forgiveness if I neglected any particular point. Yes, I had to discuss the issue of sex in a room filled with sisters, and that was a new experience for me. So, jazakumullah khairan, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Based on her MA research project. Maryam is a speech and language therapist by profession
world of academia in the field of gender, religion, and health as a means to widen her horizons in the health field. She completed her Master of Arts degree as part of the esteemed Gender, Religion, and Health program at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and she was one of the 3 students whom, for the first time in the GRH program, research studies pertaining to Islam. And Maryam is the chairperson of a non-profit organization called Little AYC and participates actively in her community.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Teach you the name of peace. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm really grateful to be part of this symposium. I was asked to focus on my master's research, which looks at women's health-seeking behavior in the context of sexual violence, sexual health rights, and the Muslim community. Now, my research focused on a case study of 3 women and their experiences in the Muslim community in KZN. And their health-seeking behavior was by contacting a counseling care line. And I'll go into a little bit more detail of how they went about this journey. A significant report by the United Nations Population Development Fund declared that globally, gender-based violence undermines the health, dignity, security, and autonomy of women, yet it remains shrouded in the culture of silence. The silence is directly attributed to religion and culture. Research that interrogates the intersections of gender, religion, and health to provide deeper understanding of women's experiences is needed because religion is recognized as providing influence on women's thoughts, emotions, social relationships, and personality. I hope to provide insight into the influence of religion on health-seeking behavior in the context of gender-based sexual violence. Now, I want to focus on the experiences of 3 women because they went through all of these horrific things that we hear about and they sought help. And I'd like to take you on a journey with me on how they did this. There are 2 points in which health-seeking behavior is influenced. The first stage is the seeking out stage, and the second stage is prior health-seeking. At each of these stages, we can gain insight in the threats to women's security, where religion either acted as both a resource and hindrance during each one of the women's journey to gain security. Now, health-seeking behavior is defined as a problem-focused, planned behavior involving interpersonal interaction with someone who can improve one's health and well-being. If we look at this definition in relation to the definition of health by the World Health Organization, we can understand that health is seen as being in a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease. The definition of health and health-seeking complement each other if we understand it in terms of the mind, body, and soul. We show how the threats to the woman's security after experiencing sexual violence can be perceived as threats to the mind, body, and soul. And we can further highlight the extent to which religion acted either as a promoting factor or deterring factor in their security of the mind, body, and soul. One of my findings of the study was that each of these women experienced a pattern of violence. That is, each of them either experienced physical, emotional, or sexual violence prior to their actual experience of sexual violence with their intimate partner. For example, Latifa, she experienced physical, emotional, and sexual violence by her husband. She previously experienced sexual violence by her maternal uncle and sexual violence by her paternal uncle. Shahida was exposed to, but not experienced, physical violence by her father and experienced physical, emotional, and sexual violence by her husband. Balance. Balance is an important part of Islam, as perceived by Sufi scholars who stress that the heart is very important for balance or equilibrium, as summarized by the Sufi master Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani, who said that the heart is the center, the point of balance, the median. If we refer back to the World Health Organization definition of health, in terms of health and well-being, this balance can be related to the mind, body, and soul. Therefore, the woman's health-seeking behavior can also be seen as striving to seek help that will not only be for the body, but for the mind and soul as well. I'd like to now describe the two stages that emerged from the data. The first stage was the reaching out stage. Now, all three women had endured violence for many years, but their reasons for contacting the care line was triggered by reasons other than sexual violence, or related to aspects of security. For example, Latifa felt that the violence she was experiencing affected her children whom she wanted to protect. Now, theories have indicated that women in abusive situations will put their children's interests above their own, and they will continue to stay in abusive situations or abusive homes rather than use their children. Some theories also found that some respondents would reach a breaking point and would seek help just to protect them. Contacting the care line for Latifa and Malika were precipitated by the love for their children. And it was noted that the help that they received for the gender-based violence was a byproduct of their initial reasons for contacting the care line. Health-seeking behavior is usually precipitated by an event, and women only sought formalized help after an event triggered this behavior. This theory is pertinent as contacting the counseling care line was the action that each woman took after a life-changing event triggered the health-seeking behavior. Now, religion can either be a direct or indirect factor on a woman's health-seeking behavior. And for Latifa, it was a direct precipitating factor for her to seek help. She was a Muslim, and for the sake of her marriage and children, she converted to Hinduism, the religion of her husband. She had hoped that by sacrificing something she held dear, that her husband would no longer be violent towards her. She was, in a sense, engaging in negotiation, and as a result, expected that she would live a life that no longer contained violence. Once she realized the violence continued and in fact got worse, she saw it as a punishment from God. She felt that because she turned away from her religion, that God was punishing her for her sins. We can see that Latifa may have decided not to seek help sooner because she perceived that the punishment was something that she deserved, and this was the price she had to pay for changing her religion. It's personally understanding her beliefs because it later changes as she re-engages with her beliefs about God and her connection to God. Punishment by God is a theme that has been explored in other scholarly work on sexual issues, such as articles by Sadia Sheikh and Nina Hull. The second stage at which religion influenced health-seeking behavior is prior health-seeking behavior. The manner in which the woman displayed prior health-seeking behavior has a direct connection to the moment in which they access the counseling care line. Latifa was molested as a child and sought help when she was in high school by consulting a private counselor. Apart from this health-seeking behavior, she sought advice from a sister-in-law. She decided to contact the care line after her sister-in-law mentioned that there was a place that she could get help from. Religion played a role in influencing a health-seeking behavior of contacting the counseling care line in the following ways. Firstly, her failed attempt at speaking to a Muslim religious leader left her feeling that she would not be able to seek help in a Muslim community. This could be seen as religion playing a deterring factor in seeking help. She says, I never had the courage to seek advice from a Muslim leader. I felt more embarrassed to talk to anybody, knowing that I was changing. Secondly, Latifa found solace in a sister-in-law. In this way, religion became a promoting factor for her seeking help. Finally, by contacting the care line, religion once more became a promoting factor for Latifa to seek help. The last 2 points may be viewed as religion being a positive factor in a health-seeking behavior and may be attributed to the ethos of the care line, which was aligned with religious beliefs and enabled her to seek help. If we view this in relation to the security of the mind, body, and soul, we understand that the promoting factors of religion helped in providing her with perceived security of the soul, whilst the deterring factors of religion went against the security Shahida also previously consulted with a professional, a social worker, to discuss her marital problems. However, she did not find it particularly helpful. She was seeking help that aligned with her religious beliefs. Religious beliefs express the sacred nature of things, and Shahida felt that these very beliefs were not being acknowledged. She said, after speaking to the social worker, she is more for empowering women. She said to me, I mustn't wear a scarf, but I also have to look at the Islamic side of things. Apart from this health-seeking behavior, Shahida also sought help from family members, in particular her father. However, he was unable to help her because he felt that his advice would be biased. My father said to me, he can't give me advice. He wouldn't be able to because I was his child, and his advice would be to me just as that. His father then advised her to see a Muslim religious leader who could provide her counseling. After consulting this leader, Shahida refers to the advice she received from the leader as helpful but sometimes not logical. In the previous scenario, she was not comfortable giving up her religious beliefs for empowerment. In this situation with the Muslim religious leader, she was not comfortable giving up logic for her religious beliefs. In her view, Islam was a religion of logic and sense, and the help that she received did not fit in with the picture of Islam. From these two situations, it can be seen that Shahida was struggling to negotiate a balance between her beliefs and reasoning or logic. Her journey continued, and finally she went to Hope Care and Counseling. It was there that she found the balance that she was looking for. Her initial attempt at help seeking led to her feeling that her faith was being ignored, and that while she was open to advice, it needed to be aligned with her religious beliefs. The help seeking consultation with the religious leader whom she asked for advice lacked a little bit of logic, she felt. And after her failed attempt at help seeking, she feared that she would not find what she was looking for. But finally, the intervention by her cousin showed her that she could actually seek help at a place that catered for her needs and religious beliefs. And in this way, religion became a promoting factor. In terms of security of the mind, body, and soul, the promoting factors of religion helped in providing her with the perceived security of the soul and mind, whilst deterring factors of religion went against security. Malika's help seeking, she's the last woman in the study, was precipitated by the death of her child. She explained that she was always exposed to trauma, and when her ex-husband was violent towards her, she never told anyone, not even her mother, who was at the time the counselor at the care. She was my mom, and I didn't want to hurt her, and also because we grew up like that, we weren't allowed to talk about sex. One of the barriers of the help seeking alludes to religion and her upbringing in a Muslim household. To talk about sex was frowned upon, and therefore she was unable to open up about the sexual violence that she was experiencing. This inability to talk about sexual matters reflects a direct influence of religion and health-seeking behavior, as it shows how certain perceptions about religion can hinder the health-seeking process. Malika, just like Shahida and Latifa, did at some point try to seek help from a Muslim religious leader. However, she found that it was not helpful, and she realized that her relationship with God did not need to be mediated through anyone. She said, I don't need anyone explaining my bond with the Almighty. These 2 points, talking about sex and one's connection to God, will be explained a little bit later if I get time. However, if we view Malika's experience in relation to the security of the mind, body, and soul, we understand that the promoting factors of religion helped in providing her with perceived security of the mind, body, and soul, whilst the deterring factors of religion went against this security. Okay. I just like to quickly, okay, 5 minutes. I'd like to quickly go into some of the scholars who have spoken about Islamic law through the lens of Sufism and those kind of theories, and the relationship between God and humanity. So, Sheikh 2009 views Islamic law through the lens of Sufism and indicates that the central tenets of Sufism can be used to reflect on jurisprudence and then to interrogate preconceived notions of what the law states and what reality is. Ali 2006 looks at both classic and contemporary texts and has indicated that ultimately sex is a divine responsibility given to both a male and female. However, unless the doctrine doctrines that inform discourse on Islam remain imbued with inequality, the true essence of Islam and sex will remain idealistic, and the true mutuality that is actually a requirement gets ignored, which can, in my opinion, lead to this mismatch between human rights and Islamic rights. It comes down to the moral obligation that each person has to use reasoning, right, to use reasoning and logic when it comes to issues such as these. Sheikh 2011 explains that this fitra or discernment is something that is an inborn capacity of each individual and ties in with the God human relationship. The relationship between God and humanity is a concept that scholars have often interrogated, and Sheikh explains this concept as being central to Islam, with roots in different areas of learning in Islam, for example, mysticism. There are other feminist scholars of Islam who have looked at the principle of Tawheed or oneness, as this concept is a key interpretive method. Aziza Al-Hibri is a scholar who draws on the Tawheedic paradigm to oppose attitudes of male superiority, and she often uses the concept of satanic logic to explain what happens when one has an attitude that is arrogant and leads to issues such as inequality. Now, just reflecting on what the brother before me spoke about, on that you lead a dua to protect you from Satan, it can also be applied to satanic logic. And then we can see that any action that goes against the action of God can be viewed as satanic logic. Um, okay. Okay, I'd like to end there before I get carried away. Uh, thank you so much for allowing me to.
Jazakallah khair to Maryam Bodhanya for her presentation. As the program director, I have the right to navigate things in a little way that we plan the program. And this is going to happen now, inshallah, simply because Mawlana Irshaad has to leave for another appointment. So we're going to call upon Dr. Fatima Sirat, Maryam Bodhanya, and Mawlana Irshaad to take questions now based on their presentations that they did. So if you have those questions ready for them, I'm going to call upon Zubayya Ahmed to please moderate the Q&A session for these three panelists, inshallah. Okay. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. So if our speakers are ready, we will allow 3 questions per speaker. And if our speakers could just address things, or rather introduce themselves as they answer the question, and just address the person that is asking the question, please. So if they are, and we'll also ask the person asking the question to please introduce yourself and to who you are posing the question. Show of hands. Okay. Imam.
شكرا للأولية عن فائد المجيد Professor Fatima Masina. There is a very clear and distinct difference in Islam and Western norms and values as far as raised this concern. Now, you highlighted on the screen earlier on regarding this, the curse of the angels upon women, and you reversed also that doesn't curse fall upon men as well, in whatever they do. We first question, where do you draw the line as far as rape is concerned? Because in Islam, the woman is not allowed. Now, obviously, in the period of menstruation, a man doesn't go to his wife. But then there's other ailments and diseases such as maybe flu, or she's not physically well, as such. What happens in a case like this also? I had some counseling with numerous couples. So men often complain about wives refusing them. Would the answer be for a male to marry another wife, which is very much frowned upon in South Africa because it's a Western country? So, just on those two questions, Shukran.
Thank you.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Tasneem, and my question is for Mawlana Irshaad. Mawlana, you spoke about the fact that the wife and women in general have as much right to expect sexual fulfillment or fulfillment of their sexual needs, obviously within the framework of marriage. So my question is, how does the Sharia define sexual fulfillment or fulfillment of a woman's sexual needs?
Thank you.
Assalamualaikum, my name is Nasreen. My question is mainly for Mawlana Irshaad today, but the other panel of speakers are also free to comment. But I would just like to know, I know this topic wasn't really discussed in any of the talks, but in a polygamous marriage, in the case where there is a possibility that things like STDs can be transferred just by having more than one wife. I'd just like to know, what are your rights as a wife in a marriage like that, in terms of requesting certain things from your husband's other wife to protect your own health? Okay?
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Khadija. The question is Dr. Sida. And just a matter of interest, when you spoke about legal capacity, what are your main references? Because you eliminated the four imams, so I'm just asking.
Thank you. So this one we have two questions for Mawlana Irshaad and two for Dr. Fatima Sida.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Nadia. The question is, I think, directed to two people. Before marriage, what is the right of any female or male to request for testing of AIDS or STD or anything like that? What is the legal right of the individual before that happens? Then also about balance. We're speaking about health and balance and responsibility. What is the right of, I think individually, we will need to, about sexual gratification. We have females with high sexual energy as well. So about the health and balancing it out, I think we all have the obligation also to be healthy and seek for health and have a balanced approach to that. So how do you deal with that sexual energy and you are not being fulfilled by your husband, and how do you deal with that situation?
Thank you.
Sorry, is there any particular speaker that you would like to address that to? Okay. Do you think, shall we get Mawlana Irshaad today? Okay, so that means he's already got 3 questions to answer. Okay, or do you want to allow the other speaker to?
We'll take the last two from the sister and the sister in the front.
My name is Tanveen. I've got a question, and it will be addressed to Dr. Sidat and also Mawlana Irshaad, if it's permissible. It was mentioned earlier on that there are a number of rapes that's been not reported. Now, in a situation like that with regard to women, in terms of the nikah requirement, there are certain things that need to be revealed to the following partner or, vice versa. Now, in the case of a rape, now there can be a misperception or misconstrued as to the young lady's chastity. And in a case like that, if she reveals her status, it can become where she can be ostracized, etc. So what would the ruling be on that? And therefore, Mawlana Irshaad and Dr. Sidat, I'd like your comments, please. Shukran.
If I could maybe just ask Sister Maryam Bodhanya to answer the question on balance, because there was another question for Mawlana Irshaad Siddiq.
Switch it on.
Thank you for the question. Could you just clarify exactly what you wanted to find out again so I can address that? About the balance.
I think each and everyone as an individual has responsibility to have a balanced, holistic, healthy lifestyle. So what about the female that has high sexual energy? How do you deal with that? I mean, I think it was the gentleman that spoke about the females that's always tired or sick. It's not always that way around. So how do you actually do strike a balance? Because it goes both ways.
Okay, so I'd like to talk about balance from a perspective of balance in our daily lives. What does it actually mean? So Allah allows us to enjoy ourselves in different ways, through food, through pleasure, through different things in life. So there's nothing wrong with a woman having that kind of energy because Allah is giving her that. So, but you got to find a way to make sure that everything in her life is balanced, that it doesn't become one-sided or it's only about that, because your life has to be holistic. So, there has to be time to enjoy other pleasures in life as well. But I mean, Allah created us to enjoy pleasure, and sometimes it is that way where the man is tired and the woman is not, and it can be quite frustrating. But like I said, I can only answer it in terms of balance in the holistic.
Thank you.
So then will we take the last question from and then that will be the final question in the panelist.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Maryam. I'd like to find out whose responsibility is women's health. Is it the mothers, or is it the fathers, or is it the individual when he reaches biological kind of state? Because to have a symposium of this nature, and so many of our educated women and academic women are researching into Islam about this, whereas the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world, but as you can see, the world is in chaos. And maybe we need to revisit the rocking of the cradle in the sense of we give birth to those men. We also have 90% input in raising them. So how can we reverse this kind of, I would say, state that we are in now? In understanding, is it the female's responsibility to understand her purpose and her knowledge that she needs to have about herself and her worth in the eyes of Allah? Or is it her mother's duty, or is it her father's duty, or is it her husband's duty? So I believe you teach people how to treat you. So if she feels she is an honorable person in the eyes of Allah and she those are rights as far as your body balances is concerned. Would this be able to go further? I find this mostly amongst all areas, ups and downs and middles. It happens everywhere. So it comes back for me the responsibility that we as women have to take about our health.
Who are you addressing that to? Okay, Dr. Sida, would you like to start first? I think the first question which comes from where you ask where do we draw the line? And I think what you're saying is that the idea of a woman saying no has its limitations. That women can only say no so many times, or women can only say no under certain circumstances. That's simply the idea of saying no because I don't feel like, and I'm perfectly well. Too many times may become a problem. I think that's what you're asking. So I think that's what you're asking in terms of drawing a line. Because you're saying, when does it become rape? Is that what you're asking? Okay. And I think that's a very, very important question because it speaks to how we have come to conceptualize and understand what are the rights of both parties within a marriage. Can we conceptualize marital rape in Islam if our understanding of nikah is that you are contracting to be sexually available to this one man for the rest of your life? Can we actually conceptualize rape when you've already contracted to say you will have sex? What is the place of the negotiation between the two in the middle of that contract? How do we do that negotiation? And I think for that, and I think it also pertains to the last question from National Lisa, the idea of whose responsibility is this? And it speaks very much to our social norms around sexuality. What do we say it's okay to say to each other in a relationship? Can I say, no, love, I'm not interested today. It's not because I'm sick, I'm just not feeling it. And is it okay to not feel it for how long? And then what happens? When we're constantly not feeling it, are we also thinking that perhaps today I need to be a little generous? I may not be there all the way, but maybe I can go a little way. And maybe it'll be a little few minutes, not the full hour that we normally spend together. These things have to become possibilities amongst us. We have to be able to talk in this way to each other. We have to be able to have the negotiation. And the most difficult part of the negotiation is when you try to negotiate and in the middle of it all you're feeling like, but if I say no, I'm really being bad. If I say no, I'm being bad. I'm just not. The sense that you can't say no, that you can't say no too many times. And it becomes more difficult because we're not taught how to do this negotiation, right? I always say the way we marry is very instructive to the way we divorce. Yeah, if we marry with a massive wedding and no time spent on our nikah contract, it's going to be a massive divorce. It's going to be very little, and there's going to be loads of pain around that divorce, right? So I know that in some countries the negotiation around a marriage contract lasts for months. But what are they talking about? They talk about the mahar, they talk about who's going to stay where, they're talking about the apartment, they're talking about the jewelry. But interestingly, in some places, they also talk about, and I don't think they get to where we need to get to, but they talk about things like how many times we eat meat in a month. Like how many times, so to know what kind of lifestyle this family is going to live. She comes from one, he comes from another, what kind of life are they going to have together? Can we consider talking about the sexual experiences coming from the past? And then this, I'll just wrap up one of the other questions, which is from, as far as I know, when a couple gets married, and if it is found that a woman is not a virgin, when there's, there was no sort of question about it before, it's found that she's not a virgin, that is not the grounds for breaking a nikah. That is not the grounds for breaking a nikah. Just so, this is as far as I know from within the fiqh. But can we have these discussions? Can we talk to each other about what we can say and can't say when we negotiate how often and how frequent or what kind of sex we want with our partners. Because the fact that we even say, where's the line between I want sex and I'm going to have it now and rape, means we're in trouble. We are in trouble if we don't know where that line is. And I think many of us don't know where that line is. And we don't know, and I say we, I'm talking about women, we don't know how to say no comfortably. We don't know how to say no without guilt. That guilt sits and it builds and it builds. And the next thing, you're lying on your back doing it for king and country. And I think the conversations have to start happening. And the difficulty in this room, for example, for us to talk about it, is something that we need to take outside the room, bring it into our marriage classes, bring it into our ordinary discussions with our daughters and with our sons. Teach our sons and daughters how to ask for permission. What is consent? There's a lovely thing that's running around on the net right now. I don't know if you saw it, but it's about making a cup of tea. And if you take the whole analogy of having sex to can I make you a cup of tea? And some of you are probably, I'm not, you've probably seen it. So can I take a little time to explain that? So what it does is it says, if you made me a cup of tea this time, and you want to make me a cup of tea next time, also check that I want the tea. And maybe you've made the tea already, because you knew I was coming home and I'm always thirsty when I come home. So you made the tea and you ordered already, and here it is, honey, the tea. And I get home and I'm like, I want a glass of Coke. Are you going to force me to have the tea? No. Right? So if at some point I can share it with the organizers and we can pass that around. But this idea, you take something as simple as making tea. You take that analogy, apply it to your negotiations and see, will you and where will you force the person to have that cup of tea? And none of us can see ourselves forcing anybody to have a cup of tea. So how do we then even contemplate forcing somebody to have sex with us? And that's on both sides.
Thank you, Dr. I'm sorry, Mawlana Irshaad.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. The first question was about the wife and women. They have as much rights and so forth, and so therefore, how does the Sharia define sexual fulfillment? I think this is one of those areas in which, once again, it would be an understanding between the husband and the wife, because it's going to be different for everyone. And this is the importance of that concept of ma'ruf, a concept that is ubiquitous in the Quran when it comes to mentioning nikah. Whenever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about that, about nikah and the relationship between a husband and a wife, it's always a matter of bil ma'ruf, because I feel that as with other types of mu'amalat, of which nikah forms a part of, a lot depends on the context of our times, a lot depends on the cultures that we come from, and the understandings of different people would be different. So what is sexual fulfillment for one lady is not necessarily going to be the same for another. So there is no specific, as far as I know, Wallahu a'lam, this much, this long, so many times a day, to that extent, Allah knows best. There are indications of, female ejaculation in our fiqh and the requirements of a ghusl and so forth, but I don't think that is directed at sexual gratification as much as it is at when a ghusl is required and not. So I think the best answer in that instance is the Sharia is going to make it as much of an obligation on the husband and the wife as it is an understanding between the two of them, and Allah knows best.
Okay, I thought there was a question particularly around the right to be aware of any sexually transmitted diseases within a polygamous marriage or even before nikah. Are there any comments from either one of our speakers around that? Yeah.
Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Once again, when it comes to the nikah and what should be disclosed before actually entering into a marriage contract, it would be anything that would deteriorate from the sexual experience in the nikah as one. That's a whole category in and of itself. And certainly an STD is something that would deteriorate from such an experience in one way or the other, even if it's not outright abstinence. So there are discussions, and scholars have not come to a consensus about whether one is privileged to ask for a screening or of HIV or any other disease. But I do feel, in my personal opinion, that it should be a stipulation. A person should be allowed to ask for that, both the husband as well as the wife. But at the same time, if either partner feels that they do not wish to actually provide that, then they are in their rights as well. And then the other partner, of course, has to then decide if they still want to go forth with the nikah or not. That is with regards to before a nikah. And I feel a similar type of stipulation should apply inside the nikah when a husband marries a second wife, because this directly affects the first wife if any such STD should be present. So in this case, it's not necessarily part and parcel of the conflict of nikah, but in her own rights as a human being, that harm may be caused upon her. And in an Islamic court, such harm would definitely be taken into consideration. To which extent this is up to the hakim at the time, or the judge at the time, no one knows best.
Okay, and I want to come back to that question on balance, if I may, because I think possibly we could expand on it and maybe bring it to something in relation to what I thought I heard was possibly in reference to what the other gentleman is also speaking, not necessarily rape, but to what capacity do we limit? Do we limit it to in terms of what you were talking about? When someone is not physically capable or doesn't have the physical capacity, does emotional and mental well-being fall into the same thing, including the fact when a woman has more physical or sexual energy than her husband?
The level of that type of question, as far as I know, is not addressed in classical fiqh. I haven't seen a discussion of that type of consideration. I do believe it should be a consideration, however, because who determines whether the lady, whether a wife or husband for that matter, is physically capable? And it's always important to make that addition, because often we, in our pursuit of women's rights, we should also remember that sometimes a husband isn't capable or not in the mood, so he too doesn't need to say, "I have a headache." I believe that they are both within their rights to a degree of mutual understanding to say, you know what, I'm just not feeling up to it right now. Even though in the classical Islamic context, or classical Sunni Islam, a marriage entering into a nikah is technically, on a very technical level, agreeing to consent. And consent is the key word here, because in a Western or South African law even, the word consent is the determining factor of whether something is rape or not. So at the end of the day, if her determination of her not being able to is based on something emotional or psychological, I would say that this is definitely an area of ijtihad, and it requires further scholarly pursuit, inshallah.
I think we have 1 minute left. I just want to check in with all speakers if there was anything else that they would like to have added.
I just wanted to address the sister who asked, whose responsibility is it to take care of one's health? If you look at that each individual has the moral agency of being a Khalifa, then we need to understand that it's incumbent on each and every one of us to be that. So, if you have the flu, who decides that you're going to take the medication for the flu? You decide. So, who decides that in terms of sexual health, what is good for you? It's the woman's right to decide if it's related to her. So she has to. I understand that in many situations, women aren't able to take that agency, but it is their right to do so. Because the God-believer relationship comes before any other.
Thank you so much, Maryam. I think we've come to the end of our Q&A for the 3 speakers that we've had now. Sorry. Okay.
There's one question I forgot to answer. It was about the source for my text. It is within the Hanafi tradition. Nurul Anwar follows on a whole series of other it's part of the Islamic homes on the subcontinent. So the tradition I'm speaking of are texts that are within the Hanafi tradition. I haven't left out the Imam. I'm walking in there now.
Shukran so much. Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Shukran, Zabela, for that excellent moderation of the Q&A. We're just going to ask our panelists to remain on the stage because we have a small token of appreciation that we would like to bestow upon them for participating in the presentation and symposium here today, inshallah. So we call upon Sheikh Islam Tariq to hand over the gifts and the certificates of appreciation, inshallah.
I think somebody's taking a photo, yeah?
Once again, shukran to Mawlana Irshaad for spending his afternoon with us, alhamdulillah, and we kindly excuse him from the rest of the symposium, inshallah. As a prelude to our next presentation on HIV within the Muslim community, we will view a short video clip that introduces us to one of the very first Muslim women to publicly declare her HIV status, that being Fahmida Mala. And the very public declaration and bravery of Fahmida helped spearhead and launch one of the first and then only HIV counseling and treatment facility for Muslims in South Africa, an organization of which our next speaker was a part of, and that is none other than Nuran Osman. And I think it is important to recognize the dynamics of actually opening up the discussion of female sexual health and sexual risks in such a public manner, which has for most part been a topic mostly misunderstood and incompetently and clumsily handled within the broader Muslim community. So we salute and commend Fahmida for her part in creating a much needed community dialogue on this important pandemic. In fact, Fahmida was was a speaker whom we are invited to speak here today, but it is her birthday today, so she's out celebrating with her family, alhamdulillah. So Alhamdulillah Nuran will be presenting after we have watched the video. And just to give you a brief introduction to who Nuran is the director at the Ihata Shelter for Abused Women. She is a mother of 4 kids, 3 girls and 1 boy. And Nuran is a committed humanitarian with a deep passion for education. She is a women's rights activist and has spent most of her career working in the field of HIV and gender-based violence. She is interested in particular in the link between HIV and gender-based violence and interventions from a faith-based perspective. So Nuran, you can take the podium while the video starts.
I am Maryam, born and bred in Cape Town. I work directly with people that are infected or affected with HIV. How I got infected was I got it from my late husband. I was devastated. I didn't tell anyone. I was just like in my room preparing myself to die. I decided that I was ready to die yet. I wanted to live. After I told my parents, they assured me that they will be supportive towards me. It took me 2 years to disclose my HIV status to the broader community. The community was really, really supportive. They said it's about time that a Muslim person stand up and talk about HIV. It's not HIV that's killing us, but rather that stigma attached to it. Everything is available for you. So why would you not test for HIV? You will not be alone. There will always be someone to support you.
Whether you're HIV negative or positive, you are the same person.
In the name of Allah, most gracious, most merciful, all thank and praises go to Him, the Most High. Thank you to the organizers, Irshaad. Each year I get invited back, and I'm very honored to be here. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, honorable guests, mothers and fathers, sisters and brothers. So I hope this is not the graveyard shift for all of you, but let's give it a shot. And I hope that I can honor sisters like Fahmida Madan who have walked this journey for a long time. And alhamdulillah, it's really nice to see a video where she says the community are very supportive. So let's talk about this. Despite the evidence of an advancing epidemic, the usual response from the policymakers in Muslim communities for protection against HIV infection is a major focus on propagating abstention from illicit drug and sexual practices. And interestingly, well, clearly not today, sexuality is considered a private matter and is a taboo topic for discussion. And so this is a really refreshing space that Muslims have occupied. And I want to congratulate Irshaad and say it's about time we have these conversations. But harm reduction, which is a pragmatic approach for HIV prevention, is highly underutilized. The social stigma attached to HIV/AIDS that exists in all societies is much more pronounced in Muslim communities globally. The stigma prevents those at risk from coming forward. We heard Fahmida say it took her 2 years to disclose. So people don't want to come forward for appropriate counseling, testing, and treatment, as it involves disclosure of risky practices sometimes. The purpose of this paper is to define the extent of the problem, outline the major challenges to HIV/AIDS prevention and treatment, and discuss the concept of harm reduction with a cultural approach as a strategy to prevent further spread of a disease that still kills. Recommendations include integrating HIV prevention and treatment strategies within existing social, cultural, and religious frameworks, working with religious leaders as key collaborators, and provision of appropriate healthcare resources and infrastructure for successful prevention and treatment in Muslim communities. And we know that AIDS is far more than a medical and a biological problem. Around the world in the year 2003, the AIDS epidemic claimed an estimated 3 million lives. 3 million lives. And almost 5 million people acquired HIV. This was 2003, 14 years ago. 700,000 of new infections were children. And the current course of the epidemic is unlikely to change unless those affected and those at risk make a concerted effort to adopt preventive measures. Apart from inadvertent modes of transmission, such as the vertical transmission from mother to child and accidental needle stick injuries among healthcare professionals, certain types of behaviors, such as unprotected sexual intercourse and sharing of hypodermic needles, such as in heroin addiction, place individuals at increased risk for HIV and AIDS. The disease is therefore largely avoidable by changes in personal behavior. In other words, by voluntary choice, but it's not always that easy. Containment of the AIDS epidemic depends on affecting change in behavior
and lifestyle to break the chain of transmission. But if we're not talking to our children about sex, and sex is one of the main modes of transmission, then what are we going to do? It's all more challenging because the forces that shape and influence human behavior that is injurious to health are very complex and often poorly understood. So understanding the role of social and cultural variables affecting HIV transmission in Muslim communities is critical for the implementation of successful HIV prevention programs. Positive Muslims was one of them and closed down. Some of the reasons for the spread of HIV in Muslim communities are open to speculation. We know that Islam places a high value on chaste behavior and prohibits sexual intercourse outside of marriage. We've been talking about it for the past few hours. Islam specifically prohibits adultery, homosexuality, and the use of intoxicants. But it's not as though Muslims are not participating in these activities. And it's not like we can continue pretending that Muslims are not engaged in these activities. So one wonders how to explain the spread of HIV/AIDS in the Muslim community. And a logical explanation is, excuse me, I'm going to ask for forgiveness up front for coughing in between. So a logical explanation is that in spite of Islamic teachings, some Muslims do engage in activities that do lead to acquiring HIV. These risky practices include illicit drug use and or premarital or extramarital sex. Men who engage in risky behaviors have the potential of transmitting the disease to their unsuspecting wives. And many years ago, and I don't remember the source, but statistics prove that 80% of married women who were infected were actually infected in monogamous marriages. Now, 80% is very high. Women, on the other hand, are directly susceptible. In many Muslim countries, brothels and other forms of commercial sex trade are prevalent because people need to survive. Sex workers have poor social support and they're not screened for STIs, including HIV, thus contributing to the spread of the infection. And close to where I live, there's a main road that finds many women who are sex workers, and my teenage daughter would like to start a care project for sex workers so that they can get tested and screened and condoms and sandwiches and soup when it's cold. And even having this discussion about her idea with others means that people raise eyebrows, Muslims raise eyebrows. Why would you want to give sex workers anything? Well, because her answer is because they're human and they have needs. We have yet to start the project. Injecting drug users also are rapidly becoming a population of increasing concern in the transmission of HIV and AIDS. Some of the women we work with at the Untitled Shelter have been deeply impacted by their choices, often forced. And I know that's challenging, using the idea of forced choice, but you can think about it. And these choices often include sex work and drug smuggling. The issue of HIV/AIDS prevention in Muslim communities is a complex one, and it requires a multifaceted approach with particular attention to cultural norms. And often we don't want to talk about how our cultural norms are impacting our health and our well-being. It is important to study the social dynamics and practices of the populations at risk, because I bet that most of us here live in Cape Town. We don't know that on our doorstep there are many Muslim women who are forced into sex work to feed their children. There are many Muslim women who are infected, who are not speaking because there isn't a safe space. Knowledge of why people behave in certain ways and the resources available to them becomes helpful in assisting them to access and utilize available preventative and therapeutic resources. I've heard before of clients who come to our shelter and say they told the alim that they're infected, and he said, well, what did you do? And it's Allah's curse upon you. And these stories now in my 70 Irshaad shelter are getting a little tiresome. But we'll talk about solutions in a minute. In the context of high-risk groups, it is important to understand that even within them, some individuals choose to indulge in risk behaviors while others do not. The question for us as Muslims is, do we judge those who choose badly? We need to think about what we are thinking about and talk about what we are talking about. When education and counseling services are not readily and cheaply available, because our country is so fraught with disparity and inequality, when accessing such services means that the user has to disclose risk behaviors and is often afraid to do so because of judgment, he or she has no force but to make uninformed decisions. Effective counseling and education have been shown to change sexual behavior and reduce the risk of HIV transmission, even in high-risk groups. And in the Muslim world, religion defines culture, and culture gives meaning to every aspect of every individual's life. But the following contentious issues need particular attention when designing HIV prevention programs for, as in our case, the Muslim minority. We have got to start speaking of gender inequality. And in a majority of Muslim societies exists an imbalance in power between men and women. It is obviously apparent, as the previous panelists said, in heterosexual relations, as well as in the economic and social spheres of life, with men having greater power than women and exercising it. For most women, the private life within the sanctuary of their homes is their whole life. There's nothing else. And so women remain uneducated and deprived of resources, making them unaware of their civil, legal, and sexual rights, economically vulnerable, and largely dependent on men who will then choose for them. Due to these inequalities, women are more susceptible to contracting HIV and AIDS, as they are less likely to be able to negotiate with their partners around condom use, around, as spoken of previously, times of sexuality or sexual intercourse. Women are also easily targets for abusive relationships and are less able to cope with illness once infected. And we won't even start discussing the lack of support. And then there's stigma and discrimination, which this workshop clearly, this symposium clearly, year after year, battles. The social stigma attached to HIV/AIDS that exists in all societies is much more pronounced in Muslim culture due to religious doctrine regarding illicit sex and also drug-related practices. There are greater negative sanctions for illicit sexual conduct than drug use. Even if there is a suspicion of illicit sexual conduct, the affected person is discriminated against and shunned by the family and then shunned by the community. Just think about the last comment you made about a young woman, 16-year-old, who got pregnant. The stigma attached to risk behaviors thus prevents those at risk from coming forward to appropriate counseling, testing, and treatment, as this would involve disclosure of their risky practices. And then, of course, we have young women who get pregnant, or I don't know if they fall pregnant, but who become pregnant, and are afraid to talk about it. And then you've got the risks of backstreet abortion and all of that, of what that entails. But ultimately, this results in creating barriers to successful implementation of prevention and treatment strategies where they do exist, and they don't exist in very many places. Of course, there's ignorance and misinformation as well. In developed countries, a majority of the population are aware of the modes of transmission of HIV infection. And ironically, I want to say that some of the women that we worked with who became pregnant as teenagers didn't realize that sexual intercourse would lead them to pregnancy, because there are myths that our children are still listening to, like you can't get pregnant the first time you have sex. And this is still prevalent right now in 2017 in Cape Town. So most persons residing in Muslim countries assume that HIV infections are transmitted only through immoral sexual behaviors and are unaware that it can also be transmitted inadvertently through mother to child, accidental pricking of skin and contact with contaminated blood, as in the case of healthcare professionals, or the possibility of an innocent spouse getting infected by a husband who may have acquired HIV through sexual or drug-related contact with other infected persons. But I want to pose the question today. When somebody is infected with HIV, does it really matter how they got it? Therefore, due to a lack of education, the expression of compassion towards those who are positive is perceived as tolerance towards the practices that lead to acquiring the infection. And this could not be more problematic. I want to also just narrate a very brief story where I started working. One of my first jobs was, in fact, working for Positive Muslims and sharing the story with my grandmother, who was a deep humanitarian and cared and loved for everyone except HIV positive people. And so her big concern was, if you work there, Nuran, and people find out, will they not think you are HIV positive? So other issues, and in addition to what we've already spoken about, the main challenges to instituting an HIV prevention approach include include poverty and economic instability, lack of education, internal conflicts, refugees, migrant labor forces, intimidating the intimidating role of religious leaders and activists, and a lack of healthcare resources and infrastructure. I can't imagine being a positive woman and sharing it with an alim who wants to talk about how I contracted it. The last thing I'm concerned with is how I contracted it. But in fact, as Mahmida said, all I did was sit in my room where I wanted to prepare for my death. So in summary, the existing social, cultural, and religious frameworks in Muslim countries and in Muslim communities do not provide an environment for safe disclosure for persons who are infected. And as I said earlier, we need to start thinking about what we're thinking about, and we need to start talking about what we need to be talking about. And so the development of effective prevention and support services is often impeded. Meanwhile, growing gender imbalances in HIV rates among women and the tendency for the virus to be found disproportionately among marginalized and disadvantaged populations throughout the Muslim world mirror deeply entrenched systems of social inequality and patriarchy that help to fuel and further spread the epidemic. For those who are not educated, cultural expectations are very difficult to disregard. Containment of the HIV/AIDS pandemic in Muslim countries depends on a combination of individual and community level efforts to effect change in behavior and lifestyle and to break this chain of transmission that still kills despite treatment. There's an urgent need for developing and implementing policy and programs from the top down that provide AIDS education and awareness, prohibit stigmatization, and advocate compassion. Like most religions, Islam is the most important. Islam condemns homosexuality, drug use, and sex outside of marriage, though the most important means of protection is obviously to remain faithful to your partner. And we focus more on the sin of premarital and extramarital sex. We should be talking about remaining faithful. Muslims must recognize that in many instances there's a gap between religious teaching and practice. Risky behaviors that may not be allowed by Islam are indeed practiced, and Allah is the judge, not us. The main challenge is how to bridge this gap, and religious scholars seem to be divided in the concept of harm reduction. In countries where HIV/AIDS is a rapidly rising threat, such as Uganda and Indonesia, religious scholars are taking a more flexible stance in justifying the provision and the use of condoms and clean needles through Quran and Hadith passages. They reason that the sanctity of life is greater than the sin of condom use, and this strategy can be used as a short-term measure, permissible under a state of emergency. I think it should be permissible under all states, because we feel like we're living in constant emergency when there's a growing pandemic. On the other hand, in countries with low incidence and prevalence of HIV/AIDS, religious leaders believe that approving promotion of condoms and clean needles will encourage sexual promiscuity and drug use. I think if people want to be promiscuous, they'll be promiscuous. If people want to use drugs, they'll use drugs. We're not going to talk about addiction as a brain disease today. Any effort directed at harm reduction and HIV prevention needs to take into consideration the powerful impact of religious leaders in the community as they play a critical role in Muslim culture. It is important to be cognizant of the reality that religious leaders that take issue with harm reduction strategies due to the moral issues involved with the idea of harm reduction may be responsible for death. There is a perception that promoting safe injection and sex-related practices will promote illicit drug and sexual behaviors. So for HIV prevention programs to be successful, collaboration with religious scholars and leaders is a key element. It is critical to win their confidence, ours, and educate them. Not all cases of HIV and AIDS are contracted through the means that we have spoken of, but regardless of the route of transmission, once a person is infected, he or she should not be treated as a criminal, but should be considered as a patient suffering with the disease. HIV is not a moral condition. So just as patients afflicted with any disease deserve the provision of clinical care and support from their family and the society, those with HIV have all the right to the same services, support, and compassion. Senegal is one of the best examples regarding HIV prevention by engaging religious institutions in a proactive role, and those who are interested can read about the Senegalese and now the Ugandan model. There's an urgent need in Muslim communities for increasing infection surveillance, and enhancing HIV prevention and therapeutic services for high-risk groups such as commercial sex workers. And yes, there are Muslim women who are commercial sex workers. We know them where I work. Drug abusers and those with alternative sexual lifestyles, not simply those who identify themselves as being either infected or possibly infected. In addition, legislative and social changes such as protecting the legal rights of the infected, promoting safer alternative behaviors among high-risk groups, and spreading the message that being a good Muslim can include taking care of those who are HIV positive would be helpful in combating the spread of the disease. HIV/AIDS education and control efforts could also become part of each citizen's duty. The international community can assist by helping poorer countries establish social programs or simply sharing experience in drug treatment and behavioral change efforts. And so, in summary, our recommendations to stem the spread of HIV in Muslim communities includes addressing the underlying societal problems such as poverty, lack of education, and gender imbalance by starting in our homes. Developing collaborative prevention and care models, including possible stakeholders such as religious scholars, academics, expert health professionals, policymakers, NGOs, community-based organizations, and most importantly, HIV-positive persons. Development and provision of appropriate healthcare resources and infrastructure building, blood safety and infection control, appropriate surveillance and reporting mechanisms, drug abuse prevention and rehabilitation services, support groups, medical care and social support, including counseling, testing, and treatment within our institutions, such as the Masajid. Adequate numbers of trained healthcare workforce. I'm sure there are many, many more Muslim doctors and nurses than any other community in the Western Cape. Appropriate reproductive healthcare programs, because even before our young girls are getting married, we're not even talking to them about contraception. But broader efforts directed at enhancing information, education, and most importantly, communication. Jazakallah khair.
Shukran so much, Nuran, for that very important presentation. And if anyone still sits with the understanding that these type of issues does not affect our community or doesn't affect us personally, allow me to share with you that yesterday in the Harapur community, we buried a very young mother who was a sex worker, Muslim young mother. I do not have, it's quite an emotional situation because we do not really perceive or understand the social, economic issues and challenges that these young women go through. And we really need to stop deceiving ourselves to think that it doesn't affect us. And even just recently, about 2 months ago, my husband teaches at the Ottery Islamic Society, the madrasa. And he was driving to work and he saw a young lady standing alongside the road as a sex worker, and he recognized her. She used to be in his madrasa class. And he stopped and he asked her, "What are you doing? Let's talk about this." She was too shy and she ran away. This is happening. It's not something that we need to fool ourselves that it doesn't happen in our community. Inshallah, I just wanted to share that. We will be going on a tea break now. As I indicated earlier, exit the hall. The cafeteria is on your left side of the parking lot. Salah facilities are upstairs for Asr, for those who wish to perform Salah upstairs. And you may also use the Habibia Masjid. We will break for 30 minutes, inshallah.